Hey guys, what's up? In today's Daily Financial Market News, I'm joining you from the beautiful country of Australia. In today's major news, we saw the Australian CPI, we also saw the Bank of Canada turn dovish. We also saw Brexit UK election finally get agreed for December the 12th, and finally today we have the Federal Reserve meeting and cutting interest rates. So what else is going on? So in most major market and most major indices across the board, they were much jittery and muter across the board as the sessions developed. This came on the back of market uncertainty as to how much the Fed would cut and also if they would signal more cuts to come forward. For instance, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, you can see now, has been almost mute on the day as it's heading towards its all-time highs at the levels you can see in front of you. Also in the session we saw the S&P 500, Nasdaq 100 also mute or relatively down on the day. In terms of the European session, we saw the FTSE 100 more positive on the day on the back of the election news. We also saw the German 30 down on more mixed data this morning. Also in the Asia Pacific session, the Asia Pacific session, we did see the Nikkei 225, ASX 200 and Hang Seng all lower. This came on the back of a variety of reasons. The Nikkei 225 and Hang Seng were lower on jitters surrounding a potential meet between the US President Trump and the Chinese President later next month. This was supposed to be headed in Chile, however this has been cancelled due to the President cancelling the APEC summit next month. Whether they'll meet is a question we won't know anytime soon, however we should get some clarification as the week and next week begins. Also, in terms, one other factor that should be considered of importance is the federal meeting rate cuts tonight and how it would have the impact on the ASX 200. First we saw the Australian CPI, which came in above market expectations and in line in terms of its lower tier indicators. However, we also saw some jitters as questions started to creep in as to whether the Federal Reserve would cut interest rates and support the economic growth as the downturn had been seen for the second half of this year. In the equity sphere, things were mute as you would expect. The Apple shares were lower on the day, Facebook shares were also lower on the day, and Nvidia shares too shared the downturn as investors remained out of stocks ahead of the Federal Reserve meeting today. In terms of commodities, things were also quite mixed. Copper was relatively flat on the day with little market news. Natural gas has risen 2% and this has been quite a boomer this week, climbing more than 8%. This came on the back of more demand and less supply concerns. Also in the session we had the US oil inventory report. This was quite key for WTI and Brent crude, both remaining pressured as the week began and remaining pressured as the session continued. The reason being, there were more than 5 million barrel build-up of inventories, which signals that demand may actually be weakening and supply cuts aren't having as large an effect as we had initially hoped. Also in the session was all gold up 0.4%. This will be quite a key watch going into the Fed meeting as you would expect. However, we can also see that if gold fails to hold at this level, then it could see a larger move lower. Also in terms of bond yields today, things were quite mixed. The US 10-year and 2-year were negative ahead of the Fed meeting. The German 10-year yield was flat and the 2-year yield was a little negative as the sessions closed up for the day. In the UK yields were both 10-year and 2-year both negative. The 2-year yield was down more than 5%. This came on the back of investors remaining concerned as to whether Boris Johnson would be able to get a majority in Parliament or not. Finally, and not forgetting, is the FX sphere. In terms of Forex today, things were quite mute, but we did see a little dollar selling. As the session developed, the pound was a little stronger against the dollar, illustrated in the chart in front of you. The key level to watch will be the 1.30 region, which has been a previous level of resistance. If it can break this, it could mean a move towards the previous highs of 135 and also potentially 140, which we saw when Theresa May was in power. In terms of the euro-dollar, things were a little more upbeat too, up 10 points on the day. In terms of the US dollar, Japanese yen, it was a little moved. The biggest move probably came with the Canadian. The US dollar Canadian up more than 100 points. This came back on two factors, one being oil being weaker today and the second being the Bank of Canada turned dovish and signalled that the economy was starting to feel the effects of the weaker global demand and supply chains. Also finally, not forgetting, is US dollar Chinese yuan. This was quite quiet today, down 100 points. This will be quite a key watch to see with the APEC meeting now cancelled and whether the US and China teams can arrange another location. That's all for today guys, thank you so much for tuning in.